It was supposed to be another quiet night in the neighborhood, until three so-called officers showed up at Michael Harris's door, flashing fake badges and threatening to take him away. But they had no idea who they were messing with, because Michael wasn't just another resident. He was the chief of police. What drove an HOA to send imposters in the dead of night? And how far were they willing to go to silence the one man who could expose them? Life in Willow Creek Estates was supposed to be peaceful, the kind of neighborhood where children rode bikes down tree-lined streets, homeowners waved to one another as they collected their mail, and weekend barbecues filled the air with the smell of grilled steaks and laughter. On the surface, it was an idyllic community tucked behind polished gates, with manicured lawns and neatly trimmed hedges that stood as a symbol of order. But beneath that carefully maintained image, control ran deeper than most realized. Michael Harris had moved to Willow Creek for exactly that sense of calm. After years of working long, unpredictable shifts as chief of police, he wanted a home that felt like a sanctuary. His wife had fallen in love with the red brick house on the corner lot, its wraparound porch catching the morning sun, while their teenage son admired the wide yard perfect for basketball. Michael appreciated the security of the gated entrance and the apparent stability of the community. To him, it was a place where his family could finally settle after years of constant change. At first, life there was everything they hoped for. Neighbors introduced themselves warmly. Michael, despite his position in law enforcement, preferred to keep a low profile, never flaunting his title. He was just Mike, the new guy who waved as he drove past. For months, it seemed like Willow Creek really was the picture of suburban harmony, but in every story of quiet streets and pristine lawns, there's always someone who believes they own the peace. In Willow Creek, that someone was Linda Crawford, the HOA president. Known for her sharp suits and sharper opinions, Linda saw herself as the guardian of the neighborhood's perfection. She scrutinized every porch light bulb, every blade of grass that grew an inch too tall, and every vehicle that parked even slightly crooked. To her, rules weren't guidelines, they were weapons of control. At first, Michael brushed off her notices, a friendly reminder about the trash bins not being tucked away quickly enough, a note about the basketball hoop needing to be moved from the driveway. Small things, the kind of reminders every homeowner gets from an HOA, but the frequency of Linda's letters grew, and the tone sharpened. What started as suggestions turned into warnings, and then threats of fines. Michael wasn't blind to what was happening. His years on the force had trained him to spot patterns, and Linda's behavior wasn't about community upkeep. It was about testing boundaries, seeing who would bend, who would submit, and who might resist her grip on control. Michael, with his calm authority and quiet confidence, was exactly the type of neighbor Linda couldn't tolerate. He represented independence, the kind of homeowner who wouldn't flinch under intimidation. Behind closed doors, neighbors whispered their own frustrations with Linda. They complained about being fined for flowers that didn't fit the neighborhood, color scheme, or being warned for leaving holiday decorations up a day too long. But few dared to push back. Confronting Linda meant risking harassment, endless fines, or public shaming at board meetings. Most chose silence. Michael, however, wasn't most people. Still, he kept his patience for a while. He paid no attention to Linda's glares when he jogged past her pristine White House, and he ignored the muttered remarks she made during HOA gatherings. His focus was on his family, his job, and the peace he believed he could maintain at home. But beneath that calm surface, tension was tightening. Every new letter from the HOA felt more like a challenge than a rule. Every new demand hinted at a coming storm. Linda wasn't finished, not by a long shot. And Michael, unknowingly, was being pulled into a confrontation that would turn the quiet streets of Willow Creek into a battleground of power. deception, and shocking betrayal. The first sign that the HOA's harassment was no longer just nitpicking came in the form of a fine. A thick white envelope slipped into Michael's mailbox outlined a $250 penalty for unsightly clutter on his driveway. The alleged clutter was nothing more than his teenage son's basketball hoop pushed to the side after a weekend game. Michael stared at the paper, his jaw tightening. It wasn't about a hoop. It was about control. He paid the fine without protest. Not because he agreed, but because he was picking his battles. Still, he knew it wouldn't end there. And he was right. Within weeks, another notice arrived. This time, Linda accused him of failing to maintain his lawn in accordance with community standards. Michael's grass was neatly trimmed, just as it had always been. But Linda's definition of community standards seemed to shift depending on her target. The fine, $300. Neighbors noticed. Some whispered apologies when they passed him. Others shook their heads in sympathy. Everyone knew what was happening, but no one dared to intervene. Linda's influence over the HOA board was absolute, and her methods of enforcement were ruthless. She prided herself on making examples out of homeowners who resisted her will. Michael could feel the walls closing in. Letters escalated to warnings of legal action. Threats of property liens were slipped into HOA correspondence. The air of the neighborhood shifted. Where once his morning jog was met with friendly waves, now blinds were drawn and neighbors looked away, afraid to be caught in Linda's crosshairs by association. Still, Michael refused to bend. He continued his routine working long hours. At the station, then coming home to his family, determined not to let Linda poison his sanctuary. But the stress was mounting. His wife, weary of the constant harassment, asked if they had made a mistake moving into Willow Creek. His son, once carefree, grew tense every time another letter appeared in the mailbox. The petty harassment took on a rhythm, a constant drip of intimidation. One week it was a letter about the color of the mulch in his flower beds. The next, it was a warning about leaving his garbage cans at the curb for too many hours. Michael followed every rule as closely as possible, but Linda always found something new. It was never about compliance. It was about reminding him she could make his life miserable at will. Michael began keeping a folder. Every letter, every fine, every notice went into it. His instincts told him this wasn't going to stop, it was going to escalate. He wasn't just documenting harassment. He was building a case. The breaking point came when Linda pushed her campaign into new territory, intimidation. One evening, Michael returned home late to find two unfamiliar cars parked on the street near his driveway. Inside, shadows shifted, watching. The vehicles didn't belong to neighbors, and when Michael approached, they pulled away quickly. Days later, he noticed HOA volunteers loitering near his home, jotting down notes and taking photographs of his property from the sidewalk. It wasn't just harassment anymore. It was surveillance. And then vandalism. Small, almost deniable acts. A scratch down the side of his wife's car. A toppled flower pot on his porch. A bent mailbox post leaning awkwardly after years of standing straight. Individually, they were minor. Together, they formed a pattern, a message. Michael's years on the force had trained him to recognize intimidation tactics. He had seen gangs use them. He had seen corrupt officials use them. And now, here in the supposedly safe walls of Willow Creek, the HOA president was deploying them. The tension spread beyond his home. At neighborhood gatherings, whispers died when Michael entered. Parents pulled their children closer. Some avoided eye contact altogether. Fear wasn't just in the air, it was baked into the culture of the community. Linda had ruled for so long. People had learned compliance was survival, But Michael wasn't built to yield to bullies. Then came the incident that changed everything. Michael was home on a quiet Saturday afternoon when the pounding started at his door. He opened it to find two men in dark uniforms, badges gleaming in the sunlight. Their posture was authoritative, their tone commanding. They announced they were there on behalf of the HOA to arrest him for non-compliance with community bylaws. A moment, Michael almost laughed at the absurdity. But as he studied them, the situation grew darker. Their uniforms were convincing, but not authentic. Their badges were poorly designed replicas, their handcuffs cheap imitations. These weren't officers, they were imposters. Neighbors emerged from their houses, peeking through curtains and cracking open doors. Whispers spread like wildfire. Michael Harris was being arrested. To the casual observer, it looked legitimate. That was Linda's intention. Michael allowed the men to continue their charade, watching closely, every instinct of his training as a police officer kicking in. He noticed the tremor in one man's hand as he reached for his cuffs, the nervous darting of eyes from the other. These weren't professionals. They were pawns in Linda's desperate game, but Linda had made one fatal mistake. She didn't know who Michael really was. Michael Harris wasn't just a homeowner. He was the chief of police, and the very authority she tried to counterfeit was his reality. He revealed his badge calmly, his voice steady as he informed the men they were under arrest for impersonating law enforcement officers, a serious felony. The impostors froze, their false authority shattering in an instant. Neighbors gasped, their whispers rising into a chorus of shock. The confrontation didn't end at the front door. Police units, real ones, arrived within minutes, summoned by Michael's quiet radio call. The men were handcuffed on the very lawn where they had tried to stage his humiliation, their fraudulent uniforms stripped of power under the flashing red and blue lights. But the true target wasn't them. It was Linda. Michael knew this wasn't an isolated act. The imposters hadn't shown up on their own. They had been sent, emboldened by someone who thought herself untouchable. Linda Crawford had crossed from harassment into criminal conspiracy. And for the first time, her carefully built facade of authority began to crack. Neighbors watched as the men were taken away, their faces etched with disbelief. For years they had endured Linda's rule in silence, believing her untouchable. But now they saw her reach for what it was: desperation, manipulation, and deceit. The board tried to cover for her. Whispers of miscommunication and rogue. Volunteers circulated, but no one was convinced. The truth was out. And Michael was no longer just a target. He was the reckoning Linda never expected. Still, the battle wasn't over. The impostor's arrest was only the beginning. Legal filings, public exposure, and a wave of accountability were coming. And with every step, the walls Linda had built around her power were beginning to collapse. Michael had spent months enduring her harassment quietly, determined to keep peace. But now, with his authority revealed and the community watching, he was ready to deliver the decisive blow that would end her reign of control once and for all. The stage was set for the final confrontation, the moment when the quiet streets of Willow Creek would witness not just an HOA dispute, but the unraveling of an empire built on fear, intimidation, and lies. The HOA meeting hall remained buzzing long after Linda Crawford had been led away in handcuffs. Some residents stood stunned, others whispered excitedly, and a few openly cheered. For years, they had been held captive by fear of fines, letters, and threats. Tonight, the chains had broken. Michael Harris stood quietly at the front of the room, his file still spread across the table. He didn't smile, didn't gloat. His eyes scanned the faces of his neighbors, people who had been silenced for so long, now daring to breathe freely again. A young couple approached him first. The husband, his arm around his wife, spoke softly. Thank you, Chief. We thought we were the only ones she was targeting. His wife nodded, tears in her eyes. She threatened to take away our home over a swing set for our kids. Michael placed a steady hand on the man's shoulder. You weren't alone. None of you were? That's what she wanted you to believe, that you were isolated, powerless. But tonight proved otherwise. Around them, residents gathered in small circles, sharing their own stories. One man confessed he had paid hundreds of dollars in fines he couldn't afford just to avoid further harassment. An elderly woman admitted she had stopped gardening altogether, too afraid of the letters that came every time. She planted flowers outside the HOA's approved pallet, and then something remarkable happened. For the first time, instead of whispering complaints behind closed doors, the neighbors spoke openly, voices rising in solidarity. They weren't victims anymore. They were a community. The board members, stripped of their leader, sat in silence at the front of the room. Their authority had dissolved, their fear of Linda replaced by their neighbors' anger. Eventually, one of them, Mr. Green, the treasurer, cleared his throat. We will cooperate fully with the investigation, he stammered. We had no idea it had gone this far. Whether they were complicit or simply complicit by silence, the community would decide their fate. But tonight, the real reckoning was reserved for Linda Crawford. Over the next several weeks, the fallout spread like wildfire. News of Linda's arrest reached beyond Willow Creek. Local papers ran headlines. HOA president arrested in impersonation. Scandal. Social media exploded with photos and videos from that night, neighbors sharing their stories publicly. Emboldened by the knowledge they were no longer alone, other neighborhoods took notice too. Messages poured in from nearby communities, residents thanking Michael and the people of Willow Creek for standing up to HOA abuse. The scandal sparked a wider conversation about the unchecked power of associations, and even city officials began to take interest. Inside Willow Creek, the healing began slowly. Special meetings were held, this time led not by a board dictating rules, but by neighbors discussing what they wanted their community to become. Michael attended, not as chief of police, but as a father, a homeowner, a man who wanted peace for his neighborhood. He spoke sparingly, letting others take the floor. An elderly woman suggested reducing fines and replacing them with friendly reminders. A young mother proposed community events, cookouts, holiday gatherings, activities that built connections instead of fear. A teenager stood up and asked why kids couldn't paint murals on the bland concrete walls of the park. For the first time, the ideas weren't met with threats or dismissals. They were met with applause. The board was restructured. Elections were held. And though Michael was urged by many to run for president, he declined. I already have a badge, he told them with a faint smile. What this community needs isn't another enforcer. It needs listeners. Instead, new leaders emerged, ordinary residents who wanted to rebuild trust and create something better. As weeks turned to months, visible change took root. The neighborhood, once silent and tense, began to breathe again. Children played on porches without parents fearing letters in the mail. Neighbors waved to each other, lingered for conversations, even organized block parties. The fences and facades Linda had fought so hard to maintain began to give way, not physically, but emotionally. Willow Creek no longer felt like a prison. It felt like home. Linda Crawford, meanwhile, faced the full weight of justice. Investigators uncovered a trail of misused funds, money siphoned from HOA dues for personal expenses, trips, even renovations, to her private home. The fake officer scheme turned out to be the final straw in a long pattern of corruption. Her trial was public, every detail dissected. Residents packed the courtroom, watching as the woman who once lorded over them was forced to answer for her crimes. Prosecutors presented evidence, neighbors testified, and Michael himself took the stand, recounting the night she tried to have him paraded in handcuffs before his own community. The verdict was swift: guilty on multiple counts, including conspiracy, harassment, and financial fraud. As the judge read her sentence, years in prison, Linda sat stone-faced, the pearls gone, the confidence stripped. The woman who once controlled an entire community with fear now had no control at all. For Michael, the trial wasn't about revenge. It was about closure. As he stepped out of the courthouse into the sunlight, he felt the weight finally lift. Justice had been served not just for him, but for everyone Linda had ever bullied. One evening, months later, Michael stood outside his home as the sun set over Willow Creek. The air was warm, the street alive with laughter from children racing bicycles down the sidewalk. Across the road, the elderly woman who once feared planting flowers was kneeling in her garden, bright tulips blooming in defiance of Linda's old restrictions. His daughter ran up to him, her cheeks flushed from play. "Daddy," she said, tugging his hand, "the neighbors are having a barbecue at the park. Can we go?" Michael smiled. "Of course we can." As he walked with her down the street, neighbors waved. Some stopped him to say thank you again, but he always answered the same: "It wasn't just me, it was all of us." Because that was the truth. One man had stood up, yes, but it was the courage of an entire community that had brought down Linda's empire. The story of Willow Creek became more than a scandal. It became a lesson. A reminder that fear only works when people face it alone. That true power doesn't come from titles or rules, it comes from unity. And for Michael, it became a personal reminder, too, that even the quietest neighbors, when pushed too far, could find their voices. And that sometimes the greatest badge you could wear wasn't pinned to your chest. It was the trust of the people who stood beside you. That night, as the fireflies lit up the park and laughter filled the air, Willow Creek didn't feel like the place Linda had built. It felt like the place its residents had reclaimed. A place of freedom, of community, of resilience. And above all, it felt like home.